Welcome to The Fully Mindful, where we explore what it means to live with intention, creativity, authenticity, and connection. I'm your host, Melissa Chareau, mindfulness and breathwork facilitator, neurodivergent lawyer and coach, and fellow human navigating this wild and beautiful ride we call life. On this podcast, we dive deep with interviews featuring inspiring guests, share solo mini episodes packed with guided mindfulness practices to help you center and thrive, and mix things up with tangents and sidebars, where my friend and fellow podcaster Debbie Harrell from the New World Normal joins me for some real, random, and meaningful conversations. So if you're ready to pause, reflect, and expand, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful. Hey everybody, it's Melissa with The Fully Mindful. About to have a really great conversation with Michael P. Thomas, poet, editor, and professor at Monmouth University, also a fellow human among humans. Not really sure what I can say. This extraordinary human being spends his time uncovering the truth of poetry, a living, breathing experience, his purpose, as you'll come to find out, and, as he put it, his companion. I invite you to listen to this humble, extraordinary poet friend and a human who has found his worth, found his purpose, and invites us on our journey to find ours. Here you go. Take it away. All right. Welcome, everyone. We're here at The Fully Mindful. We're here with my friend, my good friend, Michael P. Thomas, who is a poet and editor. He's a professor at Monmouth University. He's a coach. He's a runner. He's a dad. He's a husband. He's kind of all around amazing, sort of a human among humans. So super glad to have you here, Michael.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me. This is my first podcast interview, so here we are.
I don't even know how that's possible, how this could be your first podcast interview. I was kind of surprised that you're just like available, you know. What with all, it's Poetry Month still. It's April. It's Poetry Month.
Yeah, National Poetry Month. April is happening. And yeah, you didn't have to go through my agent for this. So.
And as we speak, you actually have students who are taking an at-home exam, right?
That's exactly right. On the Confessional Poets, they're writing about the relationship between mental illness, creativity, and poetry, and the question of how the arts and poetry help us survive.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that. Confessional Poets, that's like Plath, and I think you said Bishop and Lowell, maybe?
Robert Lowell being among them as someone who distinctly suffered from bipolar disorder at the time, depression as they called it, and was admitted to Belmont Hospital in Massachusetts on several occasions after manic episodes.
You're kind of cutting out there, so I'm not sure what's going on. But let's see. You said he was at Belmont Hospital?
Yeah, he was admitted at Belmont Hospital in Massachusetts. And how do I sound that? Okay.
I think when you're getting close to your microphone, it's somehow cutting out. I'm not sure.
Oh, okay. I'll step back.
So, yeah, that seems to work.
And I was just going to say that seems to be a link to many artists who are from New England who ended up spending time there. Anne Sexton being another one, Sylvia Plath, and a more contemporary writer, David Foster Wallace.
It's such an important topic, you know. I mean, it's one thing to study poetry and kind of get it from that, but also just, you know, something that we can relate with in you know, our current culture is mental illness, and that might even include alcoholism, you know, and other conditions that impact us as human beings. And I'm guessing that you study not only and teach not only how that impacts the writers, but how that impacts the readers.
Yeah, that's right. I sometimes, when certain readers look at a poet, or an artist of some kind, or a famous musician, they may look at that addiction in, the typical cliched way of romanticizing it as, well, that's what made them great.
Right.
And one may, make the argument of genius equals madness or madness equals genius. But that isn't always the case, clearly, and that some of our greatest artists and writers are ones who have survived that and gone through the addiction and broken through to the other side, to clarity and creativity and a different kind of inspiration that isn't fueled by some kind of neuroses or illness or addiction. And there's still a great deal of research in this area, as there is, with things like suicide, which we look at, and why people who live in more remote areas, for example, are more likely to commit suicide.
That's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah, that was a New York Times story that came out, and these are the kind of stories that I pay attention to inform my class and to bring in more contemporary research about the impulse to commit suicide and why people do that. And if we're reading a writer like Nick Flynn or David Foster Wallace, Nick Flynn survives. He doesn't quite attempt, but there are plenty of writers like Sylvia Plath who did, and David Foster Wallace as someone who couldn't face his depression any longer, having tried different medications. And I guess sort of like COVID, the mystery of the human body
Yeah.
is ongoing, and the mind is another mystery that we struggle to understand. And maybe reading and writing is one way to understand it better.
It is one way. And I mean, I want to go back to, you said there's this tendency among some people to romanticize, that addiction or that mental illness. I know way back when I was at Berkeley and studying English literature, I certainly did that with the beat poets and the beat writers. I I thought, oh, I just want to be Jack Kerouac, and
Yeah,
I
didn't
actually,
we all?
yeah, well, and I was like, there I was. I go to San Francisco and I go to Vesuvio's, which is the bar that's right across from City Lights bookstore.
Oh, I go there regularly when I'm there. Yeah.
Yes, right. So and I would drink way too much, trying to get at the Dharma, as Kerouac would call it, and not really appreciating that he was suffering, right? And that it was not that addiction and that mental illness is not to be exalted. It's something to be experienced for sure and appreciated and understood, but it is not in any way to be romanticized. It's pain.
Yeah, right. It's pain, and what do we do with our pain? And that's the question about most people's lives is, how do we handle our pain?
Right.
And then you have a poet right alongside, or a writer right alongside Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, who lived a very fulfilling life, and maybe not so healthy all the time, but definitely a longer life. And then I also remind students of the poet W.S. Merwin, who lived into his 90s, and Stanley Kunitz, and there's other poets who influenced me, who've had these sort of glorious full lives while being great artists. It just doesn't always have to be Dylan Thomas drinking himself to death at the White Horse Tavern and being rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York.
Right. You can in fact be a relatively well-adjusted, happy person and be a poet or any
Right, and that's
artist.
yeah, for transparency, and that's not me, by the way.
You're not a happy, more or less well-adjusted person.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a book in my, speaking of New England and Boston, and those that was a sort of concentration of a lot of writers who are in the confessional category. Just so happens. But in Psychology 101, when I was at Boston University, when I discovered that I was a poet and I wanted to write, there's a book that I still have on my bookcase, Adaptation to Life, and it's like, how do we adapt to life? Well, and maybe I should say that, yeah, I have adapted to life, and I've had a fulfilling, successful life for these 56 years. But some of the madness with a mind with a lowercase m still feels present, and maybe that's all of us.
Maybe that's what it is to be human. And if we're all being a little bit on the honest side, we can admit that. Most of us, at least in Western culture, will fill up our lives with something, busyness, work, the next thing, the next whatever. And we don't often sit still long enough to recognize, that madness with the lowercase m, that, and I mean, and part of this podcast, I lead some meditations, and sometimes that's what's the most uncomfortable for people when they start meditation, is really sort of recognizing how active their minds really are. And they think, mistakenly and understandably, that the point of meditation is to stop the monkey mind. But
that's a term, the monkey mind, right? An actual term. Okay. Yeah, I love that term, and I find it somewhat humorous and accurate at the same time. I love it. And I was going to say that when I think about stillness and writing, somewhere I'm headed this summer, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, where one has a studio and you're taken care of. They feed you, so it's freeing up your time so you can write and be creative. There are composers and painters there too. But that, after those 2 weeks, I feel completely transformed and out of the cycle of the monkey mind of my daily life, right, and completely rejuvenated and inspired. So getting back to maybe what we were saying earlier, that if there's some structure to creativity, then maybe that is grounds us, which gives us a place of calm and clarity.
Yeah, I like that. Is that something that you do every year?
Well, it's a competitive application, so it's every 3 or 4 years. I've tried to do it for the last since 1999, and there is something about that kind of space that for me, it invokes the inspiration, because it is a kind of sacred ground. I feel it when I'm there. For the last 50 years, there have been artists and writers who have been there in those spaces, and the minute I'm in my studio, I'm more productive than I am anywhere else in the world, maybe. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't work for everyone, because they get into a studio like that and they feel a great deal of pressure, and then they just go outside and socialize with other artists rather than sticking with the silence. Because you do have that option.
Sure.
To hang around lunch and breakfast, as the day goes on, for hours and not even get work done, and then go walk in the beautiful grounds or commune with the horses that are there.
But I could see that too, that there would definitely be some value in connecting with other artists. I mean, that's
absolutely,
that's part of it too, isn't it? In when you're doing any sort of art, whether it's poetry or visual art or any kind of art, where you have to go kind of internal, but then there's a process at which you have to kind of pull from the outside world as well.
Yeah, and that's my own sort of habit. But for me, the discipline, because I do like to socialize, but for me, when I'm there, the discipline is really not to talk to anyone at dinner time. At which point I'm gregarious and funny and socialized.
Who, you? I don't know.
And walking around pouring wine for people.
I've gotten to know you over the last, whatever, 9 months or so, and it's funny because the first time, and this is also for the listeners here, the first time that I saw you. So Michael, and I should explain to our listeners, Michael and I met in a coaching program. So in class, and I saw him, and he had, sort of the quintessential, what I would say, the quintessential like professor scarf on and his glasses. And he had all these beautiful books behind him. And I was like, oh, this guy's intense. He's like gonna terrify me. And then it was like out came this person who is just utterly genuine and sincere and funny. And I just love it when, first impressions are sort of accurate, but then dispelled by the reality of like the three-dimensional person, right?
Well, I love that description. Thank you. And I love the description of, that's kind of like the artist in the morning and the afternoon when I'm at the Virginia Center. People stay away from me because they say, what's going on with that guy?
Yeah.
But then once I can open up and I'm ready to connect with and be inspired by these other artists, which is absolutely necessary. It's so invigorating to have that kind of community. And I discovered that a long time ago, and it was the reason I went to graduate school.
Yeah.
My dad, who has been in and out of my life, but in educational decisions, school, university, we talked about it. And he said to me at the time in 1992, why are you going to graduate school to get an MFA? And I simply said, because I want to be around other writers. And there aren't any hanging around here in West Baldwin, New Jersey.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I don't know if that was also one of the reasons you decided to join a coaching program, was to be around other people who were interested in self and other improvement, or if it was something else. So what was it? What made you, here you are, you're a professor at Monmouth University, you're a published poet, we are also this amazingly dedicated runner. And I think you've done something like half marathons of late. Anyway, you have all of these things. What was it that made you decide to sort of mix things up in your world of poetry and art and running and decide to go into a coaching program?
Let's take a quick break.
Hey everybody, this is Melissa with The Fully Mindful. It's the new year, and I bet you're feeling the need to unlock your full potential and embrace empowerment, or maybe something completely different. Well, I'm excited to offer a new program with one-on-one breathwork and coaching sessions. We'll embark on a truly transformative journey of self-discovery, combining conscious, connected breathwork and embodiment coaching, and more. So contact me, Melissa, at The Fully Mindful, for your transformative session today.
Well, that's a great question. I think, like you said, I wanted to discover some new path in life, and I wanted, again, to do that with other people, but also with other people, as I learned in our class, who wanted to go deeper into themselves and into other people, into the world and perspectives, experiences of other individuals who have gone through some struggle or pain, as I think we all have. But I think, too, the push for me was stepping out of the role of being a dean, where I was advising students, in which I thrived helping students and individuals in a one-on-one setting. And I didn't really notice. I didn't know that that was a central part of my life, but others noticed it and others remembered it. And it was a colleague who said, I watched you work with the student who had failed out, and your encouragement and your coaching, essentially advising of this student, brought him back. And after watching him succeed, this chair and professor in health studies who studies wellness said to me, you should be a life coach.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. You were a dean for something like, was it 16 years?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that happened, as so many people talk about, unexpectedly, unplanned. Actually, that year, 2005, I had been awarded a New Jersey State Council Arts Grant in Poetry, an individual artist grant. Right at the time, I thought, I'm not a poet, and I needed that validation, that New Jersey State seal
Yeah.
that said you're a poet. They gave me $8,000 to free up my time for that summer. And it was during that time I was subletting an apartment in Brooklyn merely for my own kind of residency, change of scenery in this Polish and Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn near Graham Avenue, the Lorimer stop on the L train, Graham Avenue stop, I'm not sure which one it was. And I went into one of those internet cafes because I didn't have any internet service because the landlord or owner of the apartment turned that off before I arrived. And I went in a cafe, and the dean of the humanities and sciences here at Monmouth University said, I want you to apply for this job as a dean, as an assistant dean. I later became an associate dean. And I thought, no way. But then he said, you'll still teach, and you can run you can be the founding director of the Visiting Writer Series. That's what convinced me again, because I knew that I was working with other poets and other writers, and I'd be bringing an audience to poetry. And over the last 16 years, multiply that times 4 or 5 events a year with 150 to 300 people at each event.
Wow.
Poetry reached a lot of people in that time, and that's probably one of my better accomplishments if I talk about that kind of career accomplishment.
Yeah, and I just want to point out, who said you couldn't make money from poetry? Hey, you got $8,000, and then you got this instant deanship.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for my Nobel. $1 million, I think.
You never know. You never know. There's still time. And yeah, I mean, I love that this, visiting writer series that you did for so many years, and bringing poetry, especially in a time where, I mean, we live in a really interesting time. We live in this era of everything moving so fast, and everything is, 140 characters, and everything is, what does it look like, and all of that. And poetry is kind of the opposite of that, right? I mean,
it sure is.
You have to sustain attention and intention when you read poetry or listen to it and experience. I mean, I always have thought of, and I mean, I guess correct me if I'm wrong, it's hard for me, and you'll notice I stumble over the words read or read poetry, because I don't read it. I feel like I experience it. It's a 3-dimensional experience.
I love that, and I don't often hear people say that. I love the idea of it being a 3-dimensional experience. And I knew I don't remember when I shared a poem with you, or we talked about literature and poetry, and I knew you were that kind of reader. And you're definitely rare in that way, but I think there are more people out there reading poetry quietly, finding poetry in solitude, and not talking about it with other people. And when the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, does these surveys about someone's what should I call, consumption of the arts. Poetry is always in these incredible numbers of people composing poetry who may not tell their friends or family, and people reading poetry. And it's the numbers, I wish I had those numbers in front of me, but the numbers are so much higher than we know or we think or assume. And what happens when we have a national tragedy or we're in quarantine is that people do turn to poetry and literature and reading and slowing down, because it does require us to slow down ultimately.
Yeah, I mean that you're right. I hadn't ever really thought about it, but it is true. Anytime there's a, a massive national tragedy or some just moment of hope even, there's always some incredible poet who gets to speak up. And I mean, that happened, in the last year or so, right? So,
Yeah, the tradition returning of having a poet read at presidential inauguration.
mhm.
But it was the poet Billy Collins who was asked to compose and read publicly a poem in January 2002 after 9/11. And he, as poet laureate that year, he was asked to deliver this poem to a joint session of Congress, the first in, I think, 100 years that happened in New York City. And what is that pull and the drive and the move to look for some answer or some settling or harmony and balance in these poets' words? And his poem, The Names, it didn't tell us how we were supposed to respond to the tragedy, but it certainly gave us the experience of the overwhelming impact, emotional trauma of it.
Right. What was so did you say the name of the poem did not do that? Is that what you said?
No, well, the poem is called The Names, but I think sometimes readers, they want an answer. And poetry doesn't always have the answers. As William Carlos Williams said about poetry, it doesn't give us the news, but as he said it, men die every day for a lack of what is found there. And it's the emotional complexities and paradoxes and conflicting tones and emotions that often surprise people. Some of my students who haven't read poetry since they were in the junior year of high school, then they come into my class as seniors, and because it's an interdisciplinary course. And they're surprised sometimes by how conflicted the poem is as a poem, emotional paradoxes. And they see anger and they see joy in the same poem, and it can be confusing. But that is what I think poetry does ultimately, is it holds up the various places we can be in our minds all at once, and have that experience and know that that's the truth. That's who we are.
I love that. I love that you said that, it can hold up the various places, we can be in our minds, all at once. And I guess that's why I see it or experience poetry as a 3D experience, right? Because it is that. I mean, it's just this crazy, and I don't know, and maybe I mean, why or how does it do that? I mean, what is the magic that happens in the sphere of the poem that allows that, which is this very, I mean, even a very long poem is fairly constricted compared to, say, a short story or a long article or a book, whether fiction or nonfiction. And yet, in that very constricted space, is this whole world. How is that possible?
Well, and that's an amazing question. In the best poets and in the best poems, and by which I mean the poems that stay with us,
Mhm.
poems that we hear in our heads after we've read them once or twice, the poems that we turn to in times of sorrow or in times of joy. Uh, it's the words in the action of thought. It's words coming alive because the goal, not always stated or intended, of poetry is to make language sort of come across as though it were a performance of a kind,
Mm.
as one would hope for in dance, perhaps, and
Right.
that it's a physical experience, and that's the multidimensional experience you're talking about. In the same way that music can do or does, as Anne Sexton said, she loves Chopin, and she's listening in this video, this documentary of her at home. She's listening to a ballad or a sonata of Chopin. She's like, "Oh, listen to that music beats us." But the goal is that the poem can be that. The poem can be what music does in creating a physical interior world in response to language. And that's why it's so difficult, right? Because you have to do it in language.
Right.
Language is the word across the page, elicit that reaction. And not, clearly, we all have our own poets. And I do tell my students that there is a poet out there for them. If they're not going to explore all types of poets and read anthologies and read 2,000 years of work, that they can find the poet that might speak to them the most. And there is that. I think there's a poet for everyone. There's that one poet.
I love that. There's a poet for everyone. So, do you think, I mean, this is kind of a weird question, but do you feel like you have found your purpose, your calling, I guess, in poetry?
Yes, absolutely. And it was what drew me away from many other possibilities. I was working 3 jobs, different restaurants in San Francisco, having moved out there after graduating college. And the story I go back to about those days, those long days, where, again, I moved to San Francisco. There was an ad in the San Francisco Examiner that said Stars Restaurant is hiring, and I knew of Stars because I had done my research. And I wanted to be a waiter there, and I didn't have the 5 years experience they wanted. So, but the woman who was interviewing this long line of applicants that went around the block downtown.
Hard to think of that
But-
now when we can't find
Yeah.
anywhere. But yeah, there was a time when people would
Yeah.
line up around the block for a job,
Yeah,
for
And-
the right job.
yeah, and Jeremiah Tower was with Alice Waters, part of a culinary revolution.
Yeah.
in California, as you know. And anyway, I took this job as a busboy. I said, fine, I'll work at Starbucks as a busboy. Then I got another job as a waiter, and then I was working as a sommelier at Fairmont, and I was trying to keep all 3 jobs. And then I went down to 2. But even in those exhausted days, I found myself sitting at the edge of one piece of furniture, my futon, and this trunk that I had moved to California with, on which I had propped a typewriter. The urge, the ongoing impulse to write.
Yeah.
And no matter what the circumstances were in my life, that's what I was doing. And it took, quitting some of those jobs and finding a little more silence and slowing down to realize, okay, this is my calling. I'm not going into the wine business. I'm not going into the restaurant business. Whatever other possibilities there were, which were many out there in that industry. I made a decision after many weeks of really serious contemplation to then apply to graduate school.
Yeah, and I mean, first of all, I just want to like for folks out there who might be listening, it's very odd to be a busboy and a sommelier all at the same time. That would must be the most unpretentious. You must have been the most unpretentious sommelier ever. But
Yeah, my customers were much more difficult than I was.
yeah, I'm sure. And you know, and I love. I think it was probably like the 80s or 90s is when you were doing that.
89 to 91.
89 to 91. So I also was in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I love the, you know, like the image of the piece of like the one piece of furniture is the futon, because who did not have a futon in that era? I don't know, but and yet I don't know where you could get one now if you really wanted one. And then, you know, this you know this urge, you know, this like compulsion really to write, despite the fact that you had like, I mean, you know, that the late 80s, early 90s, San Francisco, working for, you know, Jeremiah Tower, Alice Waters, like that whole thing is very sexy, right? Like that is like the draw to do that. And yet you're like, I think I'll go be a poet. And so like there has to be something there, right?
Yeah, I was making more money than I had at any other time in my life. At the age of 24, of course, you know, you move into those jobs, but I probably had more cash on hand than I do now, but it was an amazing experience to be a part of that. But there was still being, you know, invited to apply to certain jobs out there, and I still remember going to tasting events where you have all these salespeople, and there were salespeople who said, "I want you to come work for me. I want you to sell. I think you're really good at it, etc." But I made my way very quickly because I had that ambition. But at the end of the day, when I was sitting alone in my studio apartment in Leavenworth, I felt an emptiness. I felt a lack of a calling. And I thought, well, the closest I can get to what I'm feeling as a need in my life would be to just be out in the vineyard picking grapes. But they had other people for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I guess, I mean, did you ever have, you know, when you made this decision to go to graduate school to pursue poetry and then the years after, I mean, were there moments when you doubted yourself, like whether or not you could do it or this was wise even, you know, like, I mean, who the hell goes to become a poet, you know?
Well, yeah, you know, when that happened, I think you just brought back me most frequently the doubt. Although one artists always have that doubt as you continue on. I don't think that ever goes away. And it drives you to make your next work because you're not satisfied with the last thing you did.
Mm.
And I would go to poetry workshop every week. And Mary Carr was my teacher. There were 6 poets in the workshop. And she was the kind of gatekeeper or kind of basic training boot camp of graduate school, because she rarely gave you a compliment. And there we were, having been the stars of our undergraduate creative writing programs. And there were 6 of us in that room week after week for 3 hours. And I would leave every week feeling like, why did I do this? Why? And can I keep going? Can I keep going? And I think it was like around early December in a workshop, Mary praised one of my poems. I still remember what the poem was. In the fall of 1992. And I went home elated and just in this euphoric space of celebration. And I don't know, had a drink of cheap scotch or whatever I had in my apartment. But it was a feeling of finally getting some validation. And I've heard other writers talk about this, and that's what keeps us going is those small successes. You know, you don't need the Nobel Prize to keep writing. You feel it, and there's no turning back after a certain point. And when I had my first poem published when I was 25, I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. And that has not been the case. But I also said to a mentor of mine at Hamilton College, where I went as an undergrad after a year at Boston, I said, okay, I'm going to try this poetry thing out. And if I don't have the success I want, but I'm 30, I'm going to quit. And, here I am.
And here you are. And it hasn't all been easy, that's for sure.
No, rejection after rejection after rejection.
Yeah. And so there's something that you've found inside you that has, I mean, there must be something, I guess, is what I'm getting at in the act of writing, in the process of writing, that sustains you despite the rejection. So the
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the devotion, if I can call it that, the commitment and the space one can get into in the creative act. I think it's this past weekend, this New York Times magazine, the Style magazine, has a feature on the hours that we put in as artists, and that there are no hours. There's no clocking in, no clocking out. It's always with you. And maybe that's the kind of companionship with the creative act that we have that's so important. It's a companion. And it could be inside of us only, but it's a companion. And
the art itself is the companionship.
Yeah, and I'm stealing a line from the great alto bebop player Charlie Parker when asked what his religion was or where he found spiritual connection, and he just said, I'm a devout jazz musician. So I'm a devout poet. And for me, I've said that over the years because it is spiritual. It has that kind of depth for me to help me have that kind of connection and a feeling of timelessness at the same time of being devoted to a practice.
Yeah, and in the teaching of it, you get to share. Just before we hopped on to this recording, you were telling me about a student's grandmother who was, sort of auditing your class from the sidelines, showed up to the videos and virtual classes, and tell me what happened on that last class. What happened?
Well, this student, I didn't know her grandmother was auditing on the side because it is a Zoom class, and most of the time, I'll see in the background sometimes somebody's roommate, somebody's out walking roommate dog, or there's some activity, and that could be a distraction. But then there was this one time where the student didn't realize that her screen, her Zoom view, included this other person's arm, and I asked the student, so who's by your side? And she said, oh, that's my grandmother. And this is halfway through the semester, and she said, well, and she's been here every class. She's really enjoying it and loving it. And then everyone signed off last week for our last formal class, and the student turned her computer view to her grandmother, who I hadn't actually seen. And Louise, I think it's her name, thanked me for the class and said how many times she had to stand up and go cry by herself because of the discussion that was happening. And she praised the students and said how wonderful and what those students were doing in class, and so impressed by them. And that's probably it's a highlight for me, is the reward of teaching, that someone who's been through, I'm guessing this woman is in her mid 70s, has been through a lot. She takes care of other people as a nurse. And when I first started teaching, I had nursing students taking my lit class. They were always my best students because they had seen and known a lot about life and agility of life. Literature speaks to people who know the fragility of life. Poetry speaks to those who know um, the idea of living with impermanence, as you and I have talked about.
Yeah, and they have the empathy skill. You know, they've built that muscle.
Right, and I would see that, and really, look, it's the older students in my classes, the adult students who come back to school who take in the most
Mm.
because they're ready for it.
Mhm.
And what can I do with someone who's 20 or 21? Well, I can inspire them, I hope, to go on to keep reading. But I do imagine that they'll forget about it for a while until they need it. And they'll know, and they'll find it, and they'll find it. Or they'll have kept one of the books from my class. And it's just so rewarding teaching and having a student write to you 8 years after your class, say, I was traveling through Greece and picked up a copy of the Odyssey and thinking about our discussions of Odysseus. And this is, this was a student I had in 2001. And so that's been my calling too.
Yeah.
Is the teaching through the poetry.
And you still write poetry.
Yes, I do. And again, that's the commitment. That's the work that I'll never give up, even though there are times where I say I might.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's hard. It's a hard calling to have because it takes so much of us personally when we write.
Yeah, it does. I when I was living in San Francisco, and as I said, I was living alone, but then at one point I moved in with someone I was in a relationship with, and she always said to me when I came out of this I was lucky to have this study space. And she always said, I always know that look on your face. That look on your face says you've been writing. And I don't know what that was, kind of, I don't know, my gaze or my eyes are expressionless or something, or I'm completely somewhere else. I'm coming back into this world,
Yeah.
this surface.
It is in a way kind of like you said, coming back to surface from I don't know where, but it is that experience.
Right. Yeah, and I always feel that in my students. When I know I've reached my students, it's always the moment in the classroom, if we're in a classroom, when I can look around and I see that look. I see that look in some of my students where I've removed them from, oh, I have to call my mom, or I have to go get lunch, or what's the next class, what's the next essay I have to do. And if I've removed them from that space into the moment, into the very present of the poem or words, then I know I've succeeded.
Yeah. Well, with that, I want to go into some final thoughts and then maybe a poem from you. I don't know, but I like to end these with some fun questions, hopefully fun. Is there a song in particular or a musician that you would say, in the words of my 14-year-old, that changed your life?
It's Bob Dylan,
Mm.
hands down. But I will say that there can only be one, just like there isn't just one poet who's rocked my world.
Right.
Because I see the mentors and I see the influences, and reading Dylan Thomas for the first time, and it wasn't just because we shared a last name, and being rattled by the music of his poems and the struggle of his poems. And that poem, Fern Hill, spoke to me at a time when I needed it, of this idea, this longing for childhood. So there's been this relay, if I can go back to running, this relay of poets and artists and mentors and teachers, and handing the baton off to one another while I'm sort of running alongside them and
Yeah.
guiding me, and the next one takes the baton. But I can tell you that there were many musicians who changed my life. Mostly they came from the world of jazz, John Coltrane being one of them, and reshaped my imagination in terms of listening. There were times, there was a summer that I listened to the same album, which I had put on a cassette tape, and drove around all summer working for my stepfather's wine shop. And it was my favorite things about John Coltrane and Sonny Rollins, tenor player, an album called Pent Up House with Clifford Brown on trumpet and Max Roach on drums, who I got to interview later at our jazz radio station at Hamilton. And for years, it was only instrumental music that I was listening to. There were no words at all. But I was also driving one Sunday morning, again, working, delivering wine or beer or something for my stepfather, gift baskets. And there was a show on WNEW in New York. Pete Fornatale hosted, well-known New York DJ, who had a show called Mixed Bag. And he played Ballad of a Thin Man by Bob Dylan. And I pull over and listen. And that was a moment I'll never forget. And now I've seen him live 35 times. So there you have it.
Wow. You were talking about jazz, and I was thinking about, we had some overlap time where we might have seen one another at some point in the San Francisco Bay Area. And maybe you used to go to the Fillmore. I used to go to the Fillmore for jazz. And
I don't think I ever went to the Fillmore. Where did I go? There was a place in Oakland. And I guess I was always looking for a club that seemed a little dirty, or the walls weren't so clean as some of the places that I found.
Oh, the Fillmore would have met that expectation.
Yeah, I guess. And well, the other thing, Melissa, too, is I was working at night all the time.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I've heard a lot about the Fillmore, and I always was trying to find those places. And then I would just get kind of elitist about it. None of these places are like New York.
And that is true. Well, going on to, I have two more questions for you. And this one's just light. What is your favorite movie or show right now? Could be anything. Or do you have one? Maybe you don't.
I do. No, I do. And I'm rewatching The Sopranos for like the fifth time, the entire series. And
you're so much better than me. I'm rewatching Modern Family. Like, what does that say about me?
Hey, I mean, I do have, 7-year-old, soon to be 7-year-old, but and TV just went away for a number of years. And I love baseball, so I watch baseball, but that turned into just listening to baseball all the time instead of having the TV on. But when I get a moment where I'm alone in the apartment, I'm up to the last season in The Sopranos, and the reason for that, if I can articulate it, is that each time I've watched that show, of course, there's different layers of meaning and understanding and questions, and there's so much that's difficult about that show. But for me right now, it's not completely, but almost entirely about Tony Soprano's relationship with his son.
Mm. And that's what's resonating with you right now.
Oh yeah, and in a way that, of course, never understood the complexities, to the point where, I have these very deep emotional responses to the times where he's honest about that challenge, either with, Carmela Edie Falco or his therapist. and understanding those impulses to be a good dad, but not only what that really means,
Right.
and knowing that what he grew up with was not what he wanted.
Yeah.
So I wish I had a lighter answer to that. You know, in the past, I always watched the show Everybody Loves Raymond. I haven't thought about that in a long time.
Oh my gosh, I love that show. Yeah.
That's just great stuff about family.
Yeah.
And you know, then otherwise it's been baseball, and I'm trying to think of one of the half dozen shows that my son watches. But there's a lot of, you know, there's the one about dinosaurs, of course, and Dinosaur Train, which doesn't watch as much of, but he watches this other show, Eat the Cat, which I really love, and Pete's dad is Elvis Costello voice. It's Elvis Costello.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Awesome.
And then they play music, and it's composed, I think, by Elvis and his partner, musician, jazz musician, Diana Krall. And it's great. It's a great show about how people treat each other and what it means to work together, and the patience of learning, and how to make friends, really.
Yeah. No, I love it. Well,
Now I have that song in my head.
now it's in your head forever. You're going to have to find something else to get
Yeah.
that meme out of your head.
I won't sing it.
But yes, well, you could. I mean, if you want to make your singing debut here on the Fully Mindful, please feel free.
No, but I do have a great satisfaction in playing Elvis Costello's new album for Sagan and saying, you know, that's Pete the Cat's dad.
Yeah. All right. Last question here. And let's see. Advice you wished you'd had, or advice that you wish you could give yourself when you were, I don't know, 21. So what would you tell yourself now if you could go back in time?
I think there are so many things, but one of the ideas or beliefs actually that I have is that along the way, my commitment to poetry made my life, and I wouldn't change anything about any of those decisions, even at times when they felt a little bit reckless or compulsive. But I've made choices to have poetry in one way or another be the center of my life. And I made a lot of those decisions, sometimes quickly, and maybe not to the benefit of other people I was in a relationship with. But I feel good about those decisions. At the same time, the advice I would give to my 21 or 23-year-old self when I was leaving college with faith uncertainty like I never faced before would be what we were talking about earlier, and that's just slow down.
Slow down.
Slow down. I also would tell that 23-year-old, don't stop running for 10 years.
Yeah. Slow down, but don't stop running.
Because I gave up running for a long time because I was sort of burnt out of the competitiveness of it.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Well, I'd love to have people hear a poem of yours if you'd be willing to share one.
I would love to. I'm allowed to curse, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Hold on. Let me just take a second. So this is a poem that came to me rather quickly. I wrote it on the beach because I live half mile from the beach at 6:30 in the morning, where I said I need to go and write, and I need absolute disconnect from other social obligations, and found that on an empty beach at I think it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and wrote out this full draft, which I felt was done in the matter of 2 or 3 days,
Hmm.
which is short, or which is,
Yeah.
yeah, for me, there are some poems that I've worked on for years. I don't know if this was a poem. I think there's a poem you saw in the packet I sent. Half Brother. And I was reading, and I should just say, some things, obviously the art that I surround myself with, literature, poetry, film. I read a lot of novels because that just gives me this other kind of way to contemplate. But I was reading a book called Canada by Richard Ford. And that's the character I mentioned here, Bill Parsons. Half brother. I've had enough of brothers. Make it 5 now. 2 whereabouts unknown. 2 far enough to betray knowing. About to wake him, I wonder how what seems innocent can so quickly reverse. Teenage, adult, baby. I hate that shit, he retorts when I play a new release by my musical hero. But there's the palm this morning pressed flat beneath a smooth face like the beach cleaned into a new desert by the truck dragging a surf rake. After the hurricane, the beach mixed with dirt and concrete left discolored, stained my clothes. Where is the sister I wished for at 13? Or the girl twin Del Parsons loves, relies on in my bedside novel? There was a man 2 days ago in the bookstore yelling at 6 gathering women, hugging. No reunions. Angry enough, the security guard stood up out of his entrance seat. Maybe my family melancholy needs shackling, sentencing without jury, an expiration season. 7 years unknown, half brother could have remained so. I wait again at the door while he sleeps, so that love might invade, pinching my elbow skin as I almost wake him by touch instead of by our shared name.
Wow. I love that poem.
Thank you.
And what a treat for you to share it. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate that everything that we've gotten a chance to talk about today. And one thing I wanted to mention for folks is that we are giving a mindfulness and poetry workshop.
Yes, we are.
In a couple of, well, I guess in about a month or so.
Yeah, that's right. May 26th at 7 p.m.
Yeah, 7 p.m. Eastern. Yes.
Eastern. Yes, let's clarify that.
And
Eastern.
I'll make sure to put up a piece of where folks can find that. It's going to benefit. It's a charity fundraiser.
That's right. Benefit Big Brothers Big Sisters of Asbury Park, nonprofit organization right up the street from me in Asbury.
And this workshop has a name, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. living with poetry, mindfulness in everyday life. And it's our goal is to have our participants engage in poetry in a way that connects them to mindfulness, that poetry and mindfulness and meditation can come together as one practice.
I'm glad you got to say it better than me because you, as the poet, say it so much better. And I'm really looking forward to it. And, I'm looking forward to the students in it. And I'm just looking forward to it. And
Yeah, I'm
I want
looking
to
forward to it.
thank you again for being here. And I can't wait for people to hear what you have to say. And, uh, especially the piece about, I guess, my biggest takeaway from this conversation is, poetry is living, breathing. It's a companion. It's your purpose. It's there when no one else might be and when everyone else is.
Oh,
And
that's wonderful.
I love that. And so thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to stop hitting, I'm going to hit the record
Thank
stop
you.
button. So
Thank you, Melissa.
Hey, everybody, it's Melissa, and I'm wondering if you all can relate. Have you ever caught yourself procrastinating or maybe doubting your abilities, or maybe you have a black belt inner critic like I do or have had that wants to sabotage your every move with judgment and perfectionism expectations? It might keep you stuck, it might keep you anxious and away from your full potential. The Positive Intelligence Program, PQ, is a powerful 6-week journey designed to help you quiet those saboteurs, embrace positivity, and find flow in your life. Through daily practices and weekly focuses, we'll work together to build your mental fitness. The PQ app will guide you every step of the way and support you, and you'll be supported either by myself in a one-on-one or in a small group of like-minded individuals where you can share insights and progress. So reach out, contact me at info@thefullymindful.com to find out how we can work together one-on-one or in a small group today.